Okay, let's try to unpack this for you. It's like a high-stakes legal chess match unfolding right at the top of government.
Absolutely. You've got the president pushing hard to, well, reshape how federal power actually works.
And on the other side, a legal precedent almost 90 years old defending the independence of some really key regulatory agencies.
It all kicks off with a Democratic commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission, Rebecca Slaughter.
Yeah.
She was fired back in March 2025.
Right, and this wasn't just, a standard departure. A federal appeals court jumped in pretty quickly, basically said, hold on, and put her back in her job.
But then things got even more dramatic.
Hmm.
The Supreme Court, specifically Chief Justice John Roberts, issued an order, September 8th, 2025. No explanation given, just swift.
Swift and, frankly, pretty stunning. It temporarily allowed her removal, so it just wiped out the appeals court decision for the moment.
Yeah, nullified it pending further review.
And look, this is way bigger than just one person's position. It's a fundamental fight over who's really in charge of America's huge bureaucracy. It's a direct challenge to that nearly 90-year-old precedent.
And what's really striking, I think, is the speed. The Supreme Court gave a deadline for final responses just a few days later, September 15th. Super tight timeline.
Which really forces the issue, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It throws this fundamental question right into the spotlight. When you elect a president to implement policies, to hold officials accountable, how much independent power should unelected officials, bureaucrats, really have? Now, some sources we looked at, especially those favoring strong presidential control, argue it's, and I'm quoting here, exceptionally dangerous for any bureaucrat to believe they're only accountable to themselves.
It's a strong statement.
It is. But of course, critics fire back, saying that very independence is what protects agencies from, purely political interference.
So it's this huge constitutional question playing out. Is the president really the chief executive of everything? Or do some powerful agencies kind of operate with significant freedom, maybe outside the direct line of the person the American people voted for?
Exactly.
So in this deep dive, we're going to dissect this administration's, well, pretty aggressive campaign to bring these independent agencies like the FTC back under closer presidential control.
And we'll dig into the legal theory behind it all, this push for more accountability, while also looking at the arguments for why independence might be crucial.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics because this is where it gets really interesting and pretty complex. The administration is aiming squarely at that nearly century-old Supreme Court ruling.
Humphrey's Executor.
That's the one. They're challenging it by trying to remove FTC Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter, who's a Democratic appointee. Now remember, back in March 2025, President Trump actually fired both Democratic FTC commissioners.
Right, Alvaro Bedoya and Rebecca Slaughter. The administration cited a need for policy alignment, basically.
But Bedoya didn't go quietly. He called it being illegally fired and, quote, corruption, plain and simple. He really pushed back hard, arguing the FTC has to be independent.
His point was that the FTC's job, protecting consumers and ensuring fair competition, requires insulation from political pressure, especially in sensitive areas like antitrust or data privacy.
Makes sense from that perspective. But the administration's supporters, they see it differently. They argue the president must have the power to direct the executive branch. That's who the people elected, right?
Their view is that the government's actions should reflect the will of the voters expressed through the president, not the potentially different views of unelected agency heads.
Which brings us back to that 1935 case, Humphrey's Executor. This is the legal bedrock the administration is trying to chip away at, or maybe even overturn completely.
Exactly. That case goes back to FDR, President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He tried to remove an FTC commissioner named William Humphrey.
And the Supreme Court said no, he couldn't just fire him at will.
Correct. The court basically said Congress can limit the president's removal power for officials in these independent regulatory bodies.
Yeah.
You need a specific cause like inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office.
Yeah.
You can't just fire them for political reasons.
And the thinking back then, especially after the Great Depression chaos, was that these agencies needed some stability, right? Some insulation from politics.
Precisely. They handled complex, technical, sometimes quasi-judicial stuff. The idea was they needed to be shielded from the day-to-day political winds to function properly, based on expertise.
But the current administration and folks who back a stronger presidency, they argue that Humphrey's ruling messes up the whole separation of powers idea.
Right. They say it gives these agencies too much freedom, makes them unaccountable, and potentially stops the president from actually carrying out the agenda they were elected on. It hinders effective governance, in their view.
Okay, so what's the underlying legal philosophy driving this? You mentioned a theory earlier.
Yeah, the administration's strategy is really rooted in what's called the unitary executive theory.
Unitary executive. Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
Basically, it's the idea that the president, being the single elected head of the executive branch, should have, well, absolute authority over everyone working within that branch, all executive officials.
So the argument is if you vote for a president, shouldn't they be able to fully direct the government they're supposed to be leading?
That's the core question proponents ask. They believe the people's vote should translate directly into how the government operates, and the president needs the authority to make sure that happens across the board.
And where do they find support for this in the Constitution?
They point directly to Article 2, specifically the vesting clause. It says, "The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America."
Okay.
Proponents interpret that word, the executive power, to mean all of it. All executive power belongs solely to the president. He's elected to execute the laws, so anyone helping him do that must ultimately answer to him. That's how you get accountability to the voters, they argue.
But I imagine that interpretation isn't universally accepted.
Oh, definitely not. Legal scholars have argued about the scope of the vesting clause for, well, centuries. Critics say it mainly just establishes the office. It doesn't grant unlimited power. They also point out Congress has a significant role in structuring how the executive branch actually functions.
So this debate has deep roots. It's not just a 2025 thing.
Not at all. You can go way back. Think about the Great Decision of 1789. The very first Congress was arguing about whether the president could remove his own appointees.
Wow. Okay. So right from the start.
James Madison, key architect of the Constitution, argued strongly for the president's removal power back then. He thought it was essential for the government to actually work effectively and be accountable.
And did the courts weigh in early on?
Well, much later, in 1926, the Supreme Court seemed to agree with Madison in a case called Myers v. United States. They affirmed the president's power to remove executive officials without needing Senate approval. That was a big win for the unitary executive idea at the time.
So Myers established a strong presidential power precedent.
It did. But then, only about 9 years later came Humphrey's Executor in 1935, which we've discussed. That carved out that major exception for these independent regulatory agencies like the FTC.
Right. The court distinguished them, saying they had quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial roles.
Exactly. Roles that, in the court's view back then, needed independence from direct presidential control. Some people even talked about it creating a sort of fourth branch of government, insulated from politics.
But you said the current Supreme Court seems to be moving away from Humphreys.
Yes, in recent years, the court, particularly with its conservative majority, has been let's say, chipping away at the Humphreys precedent. There have been some really significant cases.
Like which ones?
Well, SELA law in 2020, dealing with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, and Collins v. Yellen in 2021, involving the Federal Housing Finance Agency.
And what did those cases decide?
In SELA law, the court struck down rules that limited the president's power to fire the CFPB director because it was a single director agency. Justice Alito wrote that the Constitution doesn't allow even modest restrictions on removing heads of single director agencies.
Okay, so targeting the structure.
Right. And Collins extended that thinking to the FHFA director, again finding similar removal restrictions unconstitutional. So the trend seems to be reasserting more presidential control, at least over agencies headed by a single person.
It's like watching a legal pendulum swing back and forth over decades, isn't it? From Madison to Myers, then Humphrey's exception, and now back towards a stronger unitary view.
That's a good way to put it.
And the administration's position is crystal clear. They want more accountability, more policy alignment directly with the White House. They see powerful, unelected bureaucrats as a potential problem for democratic governance.
Yes, that quote about it being exceptionally dangerous for bureaucrats to think they're only accountable to themselves really captures that perspective. They see it as a fundamental issue of democratic control.
But there's obviously the counter-argument, the need for expertise and insulation from politics.
Absolutely. And it's a really tough balance to strike. Should agencies full of career experts be shielded from the political agenda of the elected president? Proponents of independence say yes, absolutely.
Why? What's the core argument for independence?
They argue it allows for long-term stability, decisions based on evidence and expertise, not just politics. It protects crucial functions. Think environmental rules, financial regulation, consumer safety from being whipsawed by changing political winds. It safeguards nonpartisan judgment.
So independence as a shield against politicization.
Exactly. But the unitary executive advocates see it differently. They want to prevent what they see as political interference against the president's agenda by entrenched bureaucracies. They want to ensure the president can actually execute the platform voters chose.
It really comes down to two very different visions of how the executive branch should operate, doesn't it?
Fundamentally, one emphasizes direct presidential control for accountability. The other emphasizes structural autonomy for expertise and stability.
And you mentioned this isn't just about the FTC. There are other signs this is a broader strategy.
Yes, this fight over the FTC seems part of a bigger picture. We're seeing a similar situation brewing with Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook. The president is reportedly seeking her removal, too, citing allegations of mortgage fraud.
So multiple fronts opening up?
It signals a coordinated effort, a consistent strategy to bring these regulatory bodies under much tighter presidential oversight. It's not just random dismissals. It looks like a concerted push.
Does this connect to things like Project 2025 that we've heard about?
It aligns very closely. Project 2025, for anyone unfamiliar, is a massive transition plan put together by conservative groups like the Heritage Foundation.
Designed for a potential new administration.
Exactly. To hit the ground running and implement a conservative agenda quickly. And a key part of its proposals is using the unitary executive theory to maximize presidential control right from day one.
How would they do that, practically speaking?
It goes beyond just firing commissioners. They talk about reclassifying potentially tens of thousands of federal civil servants, moving them from protected career positions to Schedule F or similar at-will employment.
Meaning they could be hired and fired much more easily by the president, based on loyalty or policy agreement.
That's the idea. To ensure the bureaucracy is responsive to the president's agenda and remove perceived obstacles. It's a strategic plan to overcome what they see as bureaucratic resistance.
Of course, critics have raised huge alarms about that possibility.
Oh, absolutely. Critics warn that could effectively dismantle the professional civil service, gut institutional knowledge, and lead to a far more politicized and potentially less stable federal workforce. Huge implications.
So where does this leave us? The Supreme Court's decision on Commissioner Slaughter and the challenge to Humphrey's executor, it feels like a potential landmark moment.
It really is. It could fundamentally redefine the balance of power within the executive branch, potentially for generations.
So, will we see a shift towards, as proponents hope, a more accountable government directly reflecting the voters' choice?
That's the argument they're making. More responsive, more aligned.
Or will the concerns about too much presidential power, about politicizing expertise, about weakening the checks and balances within the executive branch itself, will those concerns prove valid?
That's the big question hanging over all of this. We're really talking about the fundamental structure and operation of American government.
So here's something for you to think about. If a president is elected to lead the country, how much independence should any part of the executive branch realistically have? Where do you draw the line between ensuring democratic accountability to the voters and preserving the need for impartial, expert-driven governance in really complex policy areas?
It's a core tension, isn't it? Baked right into our constitutional system. And this case is forcing us all to confront it head-on.